I suppose this is going to be a question that's going to get us into definitions, but uh, I guess one of my questions is, do you think that the concept of Zionism is inherently defensible, or is it indefensible? I mean, there are plenty of people who say that,
Yes,
Zionism is inherently
yes,
wrong, and I
yes,
suppose your answer is probably going to be something like, it depends on what we mean by the term.
yes. Until 1948, there were forms of Zionism, sometimes one term is called cultural Zionism, that did not believe in a Jewish state. I mean, that's kind of weird for people to hear now
Hmm.
because now Zionism and Jewish state. Noam Chomsky, as a
Yes.
very, very young person,
Yeah.
was a member of
Right.
a Zionist youth group that opposed the creation of a Jewish state. That
Yeah.
was the position of Martin Buber, right? So there was a form of Zionism that meant kind of Jewish cultural flourishing in historic Palestine. That form of Zionism, I don't think is inherently oppressive because it's
Hmm.
compatible with equality under the law. But the Zionism that actually emerged in state form as the
Hmm.
ideology of the state in 1948 is built on this legal supremacy of Jews, and therefore I think is an inherent contradiction to principles of liberal democracy.
Now, you've gone there back to 1948. One of the other points that you make in your book is that early in the history of Zionism, it's the rhetoric was often explicitly colonial. There is
Yes.
now an effort to suggest that Israel is acting defensively against aggressors, but actually the language of Jabotinsky, for instance, who was
Yes.
kind of the intellectual forebear of Netanyahu, was, no, we're the settlers, they're the Indians, essentially the
Yes.
equivalent of the American Indians, and we're going to hold them off.
Yes, because colonialism was not a dirty word at that time, right?
Hmm.
And many Jews and others get upset now because they suggest that if you suggest that Israel, Zionism, had these colonial features, you're denying Jews have a connection to the land. But Jabotinsky was certainly aware that Jews pray, face Jerusalem, and that our liturgy is filled with references to what we call Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. But he didn't see that as any contradiction to the idea that this was also a movement led by Europeans who, like non-Jewish Europeans, had a certain attitude towards these parts of the world beyond Europe, which they saw as backward, and they saw themselves as bringing modernity and progress, and they believed that they had the right to dominate the people that were there in the name of this modernity and progress. And it usually didn't work out very well for the people who came under that colonial rule. So it was a much more frank discourse in a lot of ways than what we hear now.
Well, there are still Israelis. You cite, for instance, the historian Benny Morris, who's kind of
Yes.
almost an embarrassment to some, because he's very frank, in that
Yes.
he says, no, Ben Gurion wanted to transfer the Arabs, and that was a good thing. Where they needed to be expelled, and ethnic cleansing isn't always bad. That's like a direct quote from Benny Morris. Is like, sometimes you got to
Yes.
ethnically cleanse some people.
Right. So, I mean, I think one of the differences that Israeli discourse has sometimes been more frank in this regard, Jewish Israeli discourse, than American discourse, which
Hmm.
tries to translate Israel's actions and defend it within a kind of vaguely liberal paradigm in centrist circles. I mean, it's interesting now in the Trump era, maybe some of that is going away in the United States too. And so even that patina is being lost here as well.
Oh, in your book, I mentioned that you talk about the story of Purim. One of the things that you do so well is that you excavate kind of parts of Jewish history and of biblical teaching and stories that you think need to be recognized and grappled with. One of the things that you talk about is the obscuring of the Book of Joshua, which is kind of, maybe you could mention that and how that kind of fits uncomfortably into certain narratives.
Sure. Maybe the only person who's asked me that question, so I appreciate it. The point I'm trying to make is that in claiming Jewish indigeneity to the land, American Jewish organizations will often say, well, there were these ancient Jewish kingdoms there, which was true. But what they don't acknowledge is that according to the Hebrew Bible itself, these were the product of a conquest. Now, again, whether there ever was such a person named Joshua and what he actually did. This is all again, this is not history. This is sacred text. But the point I'm trying to make is that when contemporary Jewish leaders talk today, they excise out those elements of our own tradition that talk about conquest in the same way they avoid or kind of evade Israeli actions today that might be morally problematic in order to create this, what I call kind of virtuous victim story.
Just to conclude here, I think a lot of people probably feel deeply, deeply hopeless and pessimistic about the future of the Israel-Palestine conflict right now. The destruction of Gaza has been hideous. There, by some estimates, over 100,000 lives have been lost. Trump is talking about the full ethnic cleansing of Gaza. We really don't know the future of the conflict. However, you do in the book mention, and as an example, South Africa, where you have a family background, and where, obviously South Africa isn't perfect today, but you do talk about it as an example of a place where the same kinds of stories were told, and where they eventually came to be seen ridiculous, and apartheid did in fact eventually crumble. So maybe we could end on, what is a potential vision for a conclusion to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know how history will turn out, and you're right. Right now, it looks extremely bleak. But there are moments we can point to in the past where great moral movements have made things that seemed impossible at one point become possible. I know from personal experience that in the as late as in the 1980s, it was impossible for white South Africans to imagine that there would be a black government, and indeed that they would be safe under one. And yet it came to pass, just as many Americans in the first half of the 20th century could never imagine a U.S. military where white soldiers took orders from black officers. But the civil rights movement made that come to pass. So the question is, can there be a movement on behalf of Palestinian freedom that matches the kind of power that can make the impossible possible? We don't know, but I think that's the imperative for us to do whatever we can to help bring that about.
And there's more where that came from at patreon.com/current affairs. Go there, subscribe to the Current Affairs podcast. Current Affairs is an independent, non-profit media organization. We need your support. Thanks for listening.